weather to join us. I know that this has been an unfortunate change in plan, but we're delighted that so many of you have joined us, and I think there'll be a few more people coming in as we get underway. We are going to have an abbreviated program today because some of our speakers were not able to make the change and to make it down here. But we're thrilled that several of them have, and we're going to be introducing them soon, including some who drove through the snowstorm just to get here. So we're really delighted. But let me take a minute to introduce myself and our initiative, and then we will proceed with our program. My name is Elizabeth Lossis. I am a senior fellow at the Nicholas Institute. And we have started an initiative through the Nicholas Institute and also with Duke Kunshan University in China, looking at the environmental and social impacts of the Belt and Road Initiative. And just a few words on the Belt and Road, which is also commonly referred to as One Belt, One Road. As many of you probably are aware, about 4 or 5 years ago, the government of China announced a new initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative, which aimed to connect Africa, Asia, and Europe back to China, mostly through infrastructure investments, as a massive program, really very similar to the U.S. Marshall Plan of a half-century ago, in order to build economic and other links to these countries. This is a huge initiative with massive economic, geopolitical implications, but also environmental and social implications. It was initiated in 2013, but last year really became formalized, and it's a major program of President Xi. So our interest at Duke and at Duke Kunshan is that the implications of this program really for the environment and for social issues are quite extraordinary. On one hand, a lot of the infrastructure, large infrastructure investments in the past have been quite harmful, particularly to the environment, such as roads opening wilderness areas. I think we'll hear quite a bit about this today. But on the other hand, a lot of the planning and rhetoric around the Belt and Road Initiative is to make this a green initiative to actually help improve environmental and economic conditions. And that is really what we are interested in pursuing, trying to understand how these new investments can occur. So why are we looking at Africa? Well, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it has 6 corridors, trade corridors, 3 of which are overland and 3 maritime. But as the initiative has evolved, it has actually moved to many other countries, including all over Africa and all over, in fact, Latin America. And so we're particularly interested in this connection between China and Africa because it appears that the potential of the impact of this infrastructure is particularly large on the environment. Much of the investments over the last 10 years in Africa have been in linear infrastructure, such as roads and railways, as compared to, say, in Asia, where there's been a greater preponderance of the investment in energy projects and other sectors. But also, the other reason is that Duke has a lot of faculty and researchers and students who have been quite active in Africa and have a lot of facilities and experience and connections there. So it's an area where we thought we would be able to be particularly impactful. So the purpose of today's workshop is to acquaint everybody with some of the issues surrounding this, but also to address 3 major questions. And we hope during the discussion period that the audience, because we have a smaller audience today, will actually help address some of these 3 questions. can I just... Oh, whoops, sorry. Here we go. So there are 3 questions that are sort of the overarching questions for today. And each one of them is, well, let me just give a little background. The first one is the government of China has pledged that the Belt and Road Initiative should promote ecological progress in conducting investment and trade, increase cooperation in conserving the eco-environment, protecting biodiversity, and tackling climate change, and join hands to make the Silk Road an environmentally friendly one. Our question is, what is actually required, particularly of the government of China and those sources that are funding these investments to make this a reality? This is really what we're driving at. Our second question is, it's been hypothesized that the Eastern paradigm, or the Chinese financing paradigm, projects are financed faster, while Western paradigm projects, such as, say, the World Bank projects, are more bureaucratically tedious, with delays caused by stringent social and environmental safeguards, layered and slower decision-making process, as well as a general lack of coordination between approval authorities and stakeholders. So how can the recipient countries, those countries in Africa receiving the aid, make sure that they safeguard themselves against the negative social and environmental outcomes while still enjoying the benefits from these infrastructure? In other words, how can these countries take advantage of Belt and Road but not be taken advantage of? And then finally, how can Duke and our partner organizations best support efforts by China and recipient countries to allow sustainable and healthy development? So in just a moment, I am going to introduce my colleague Lydia Olander, who's also very involved in this initiative, to introduce our speakers. But I first want to thank our sponsors. This is largely being funded by the Duke in Africa initiative, which is supporting this workshop and provided a fair amount of substantive support reaching out to interested folks. And also, of course, to the Nicholas Institute and to Duke Kunshan University. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lydia.
All right. Can you hear me through here? Does that work? Is that on? Yep. Okay. Great. Well, before I get started, I just want to say a huge thank you to Liz Losses, because the amount of effort and the work put into coordinating and putting together this event, particularly during this snowstorm, has been tremendous. So I just want to also note the huge amount of work that Liz and Sarah and Kate Cobb have put into organizing this event. So I am just here to introduce the speakers. We're going to start with, I'm just going to give you an order of events here. Howard French will go first, and he's joining us by Skype in just a moment. And then we'll have Michelle Lee. And then after that, I don't think our third speaker has yet arrived. Okay, well, we might have April Rafiu speak, but if not, if she's a little late, there was an accident on the road, she's trying to get here, Jackson Ewing will step in and be the next speaker. But after that, we'll have a short break, and then we're going to have the rest of our speakers go. And then we will have Tao Hu and Jingjing Zhang go as our last part of our second panel. So that's the order of events. Given that everything's changed, I just wanted to make sure what the current plan was. So Howard French is at the School of Journalism at Columbia University, and he's going to talk. His talk is entitled From Going Out to One Belt, One Road, Understanding China's Africa Policies in a Global Perspective. Howard's a career foreign correspondent and global affairs writer and the author of 5 books. And I am going to turn it over to him on Skype now. Howard, let's give this a try and make sure it's working.
Hi. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. Great. Go ahead.
Pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry that the conference has had so much difficulty with the weather, and but happy that you've been able to make it all come together. I think I see Prasenjit Dwara in the background there? How are you, Prasenjit? It's great to see you. He was a very kind host to me in Singapore a few years ago over dinner at his house, and I'm very grateful for the conversation and all of the stuff that he, in terms of thinking about the world that I was able to glean from him. I had really hoped to see you at this thing and had prepared a gift to bring, so expect something in the mail. I don't have anything to say about the environment per se. What I'm going to do in a fairly constrained period of minutes is to try to set up a kind of historical perspective for understanding or trying to understand what's going on. I spent the early half of my career as a journalist involved in much of my time anyway involved with Africa, and have spent the subsequent half of my career with most of my time concerned with East Asia and especially with China. And this is kind of a fortuitous biographical accident because over this very same time span, the world has seen these different disparate regions kind of become tied together in a number of ways that nobody could really have foreseen, certainly not at the outset of my career. I want to situate the embrace that China has mounted with Africa since the mid-1990s, and One Belt, One Road, or BRI, as it's also sometimes called, in a series of decisions that began to be worked out in China in the late 1980s and which sort of came to a head in the early 90s or to mid-90s. I usually run through this material in the space of an hour, and I'm going to try to do it in about 15 minutes. So I'm compressing a lot, and I'm going to try to go fast, but I hope you can bear with me. Beginning in the late 1980s and culminating, as I said, by the mid-90s, China was assessing the successes of Deng Xiaoping's very famous economic reforms, and especially the special economic zones, which began as a very careful experiment that used discrete and small local areas in China to attract foreign capital and foreign managerial expertise and technology to create modern industry, mostly in the beginning assembly industry or textile type industry, very simple assembly, injection plastics and textiles. And this began as I won't say timid, but as a very careful experiment, because the Chinese leadership was worried that there were conservatives within the Communist Party who thought that this could who were wary of the introduction of capitalism into China, or also wary that there could be political or social unrest if some Chinese were seen to be getting ahead via employment in the cash economy in modern industries, and most other Chinese were not. Anyway, a decade on, the special economic zones, as they were called, were immensely successful, and much, if not all, of the opposition to them had melted away. China's takeoff had been launched, and so by the late 1980s, early 90s, the Chinese leadership is trying to figure out what should be our next step. And they looked back on the special economic zones and very astutely assessed them for all of their success as being as also containing an inherent trap. In other words, success can sometimes be a trap. Why would special economic zones and their success constitute a trap for China, for the perspective of the leadership? Well, for two reasons. Special economic zones can never, by definition, because they are tiny, tightly circumscribed spaces, could never really employ the vast hinterland of the Chinese state, with the hundreds of millions of people who lived outside of the relatively wealthy coastal areas. And so as much money as China could make from special economic zones, they could never really offer employment prospects for the bulk of the Chinese population, and could never by themselves really float China in a lasting way to sustain its economic takeoff. And so the Chinese leadership said, we can't be complacent. This can't be our principal strategy going forward. It's great that it worked. It's great that there was no unrest. It's great that we didn't become an adjunct or a kind of appendage of the West. We've succeeded, relatively speaking, with the first decade of this kind of economic and social experiment. But what do we do next? What's the best way forward? And the Chinese leadership began to sort of arrive at a few very careful calculations about where their greatest opportunity lay in terms of economic policy. And they said, first of all, that there are inherent limits in terms of the benefits to Chinese society of inbound investment. In other words, this special economic zone model that relies on capital coming into China, expertise, managerial expertise, or technology coming into China, has certain benefits, but limited benefits. That the real profits come in a longer term sense from outbound investment, from becoming outwardly bound agents of globalization. In other words, they wanted very much to benefit from an inwardly bound globalization in the very beginning, but could see by the late 80s, early 90s, that to really sustain China's takeoff and to rise to the next level in terms of prosperity, China had to become an agent of globalization itself. The other reason for this decision was that involves an economic concept called value added, that as long as China was producing things in an assembly basis for foreign companies, and which were the entities from foreign countries, China's share of the profits from that production would be very limited. You can think about the iPhone as a model of this. So iPhones are assembled by a Taiwanese company called Foxconn in Guangdong province. And the Chinese share of the profits that, an iPhone, as you all certainly know, is an immensely profitable item. Most of the shares of those profits go to whom? They go to Apple. Apple doesn't do any of the dirty work. Apple does almost none of the labor. There's none of the assembly taking place in California where Apple has its headquarters. All of that's being done in China, and yet China is only capturing a small piece of that dollar. The Chinese leadership sort of grasped this beginning in the late 80s and early 90s and said, we have to find a way to produce more added value in terms of our economic processes, and especially our industrial processes. And so this is another argument in terms of going out, in terms of thinking about becoming an actor in globalization in an outward sense. China had to develop, the leadership already had begun to understand, its own companies that could capture greater value through its own production processes and find markets overseas where they could do this. So where to begin? China surveys the world. It looks around. The era we're talking about, the late 80s, the early 1990s, is the formal end of the Cold War. A variety of things are happening, as you would expect, all over the world as a result of the end of the Cold War. Western Europe is looking very much eastward toward Eastern Europe, trying to figure out how to integrate Eastern Europe's labor markets and financial markets, such as they were, into the Western European economic sphere. And the United States, very briefly considered by some to be a kind of a unipower, as a French thinker once called the United States of that era, was kind of searching for a mission for itself in the world, unusually, having been locked in a kind of duality with the Soviet Union for several decades. The Soviet Union disappears. The United States is kind of without an explicit mission in terms of its own geopolitics. Ends up becoming obsessed, and I'm really radically simplifying this, but ends up becoming very obsessed with the Islamic world and fighting a series of wars in the Islamic world, a very broad swath of geography. So the Chinese are surveying the world and thinking, We have to go out, we have to create brand added value. We need our own companies that can do this, but we don't have any global companies. We don't have any powerful brands. We don't have any international markets for manufactured goods or things of our own design, really. Where can we begin? And the result of this thought process, which begins in the late 1980s and then culminates by the mid 1990s, was Africa. Africa is the place we should go. The reasons for this decision were several. I'm just going to focus on a couple of them because of time. The first of them has to do with the kind of geopolitical landscape that I described. Western Europe, which had been the colonial overlord of Africa for the last century plus, had diverted its attention away from Africa in an almost radical sense and was now preoccupied with integrating the rest of Europe. And the United States, which was never, I shouldn't say never, but which had typically not been terribly wrapped up in African affairs, was itself also not really paying attention to Africa. So China sees this vast geopolitical space called Africa essentially unattended by the major powers of the day and says, this is an ideal place for us to go out and try to begin to put together the building blocks of the sorts of things that I said the Chinese leadership had selected for itself as great priorities of becoming an outward globalizer, of building companies that could build brand value and gain and secure added value from production chains, et cetera, et cetera. And Africa looked great for two reasons. One, because nobody else was paying attention to Africa, as I have said, in the geopolitical sense, but also because Western, Japanese, and Western European and American, North American, and Japanese companies didn't really send their A teams to Africa. There was not a whole lot of business interest in Africa. Africa was, in the way the Western press treated it, not even really regarded as treated as an economic space. It was thought of as a humanitarian space. Who thinks of Africa as being economically interesting? It's a burden. The very vocabulary of Africa, I'm saying it was thought of as a burden. I'm not saying it was objectively a burden. The very vocabulary around Africa is very revealing. We talk about aid as this kind of the primary lens through which we discuss Africa. And often, even in the my introduction just a few minutes ago, the word aid came up. And I want to invite you all to be very skeptical of the term aid. Aid is not always what it seems, or when the word aid is used, one's not ever, if one is careful, quite sure what that really means. Is it really aid or is it something else? Anyway, Africa was not seen as an economic space by the West or by Japan. So China thought, we don't have globally competitive companies. This is a great place for us to send fledgling companies to where they can cut their teeth. They can begin to establish markets and expertise and become competitive in a global sense and understand corporate governance in an environment outside of China that will redound to their benefit and to our benefit, meaning the Chinese benefit in the longer term sense. This is a good place to begin. It's not super competitive. The other reason was demographics. So by the middle of this last century, by the late in the last century, in the late 1980s, Africa was about 850 million people. The Chinese, in the process of this survey, sort of came to understand that Africa would be, the demographics of Africa were such that by the middle of the present century, Africa would constitute about 2 billion people. So it would go from 850 million to about 2 billion, and that by the end of the present century, Africa would be have a population between the range, the projections vary, but the range is 3 to 4 billion. Some people say even more than that. And so the Chinese leadership in this assessment say Africa, they conclude rightly that Africa is the place where the greatest marginal increase of the human population is going to take place in the next century. And if we want to, as our vocation, nationally speaking, to be the producers of things that people will buy, we should be interested in where the new people are going to come from. And so these two things coincide. the desire by China to create global firms that can go out and produce things and capture added value, and the African demographics, meaning all of the, not all of them, but a vastly disproportionate share of the young people of the future are going to be Africans. This is a great place for us to get started. And so the Chinese leadership then says, as it does with most great decisions, it sets up a kind of competitive process among Chinese provinces where the center, as it's called, meaning the leadership in Beijing, tells the provinces what its goals are and tells the provinces, you go out and you achieve these goals, you pursue these goals, and we're going to assess your performance on the basis of how successful you have been in attaining these goals. And so the goal in question that we're speaking about here is called going out. And by 1995, this becomes the explicit policy of China, that China's goal, geopolitically speaking, should be to go out, 出去 in Chinese. And the Chinese center, the central leadership had this discourse with the provinces that said you should have your provincial company. There were almost no big private companies in China at the time. And so all of the companies that we're speaking of that were told to go out are state companies, which in essence at the time actually meant provincial companies, companies owned by provincial governments. And so the center says you go out, and the provincial governments know that their leaderships are going to be judged on the basis of the success of their going out. And I forgot one little step here. Jiang Zemin, who was in charge, the president, head of the Communist Party at the time, actually told, this was not widely noted in the Western media at the time, but Jiang Zemin actually said explicitly before 1995 that the goal of going out, the first goal of going out, should be going out to Africa. And so the provincial leadership knows that it's going to be assessed on this basis. They look around, how do we go out? Where do we don't know anything about Africa? We haven't really been involved with Africa. What are we going to sell to Africans? This discourse about Africa not really being an economic space was common to China as well. Africa is not really an economic space. What do we do going out to Africa? What are we going to do there? And so a series of conversations take place between the center, between the Chinese banking system, which is a state banking system, and provincial leaderships, which concludes, and again, I'm going very fast here, listen, the one area that we can be competitive in is infrastructure. We have already by 1995 attained a degree of reconstruction in China in terms of infrastructure that has rarely been seen, has by this point never been seen, by the present never been seen before. The scale of infrastructure development that we notice today in China has never been achieved before anywhere in the world, but in the mid-1990s already it was quite remarkable. And so the Chinese center and the provinces are saying this is an area where we can begin. The African countries are starved in terms of their infrastructure development. They are very needy, and if the Chinese banking system can come up with packages of loans and financial support for provincial infrastructure companies, we can create a formula that will attract these African countries to do business with us, and we can begin to go out that way, and we will offer to the Africans who are in great need of infrastructure attractive packages in terms of infrastructure development. This is the birth of the current Africa boom that we see in China-Africa relations. This is relevant. I'm going to try to wrap up here. This is relevant for your conversations in a broader sense about BRI, because I see the last 20 years in China-Africa relations really as a kind of laboratory for One Belt, One Road. China spent the last 20 years pursuing this going out in Africa, making infrastructure the centerpiece of its going out strategy in Africa, doing so for all of the reasons that I described to you, and has now achieved this kind of bulking up to the point where it has globally competitive infrastructure companies that have deep international experience and strong benches and lots of fixed capital and architectural and engineering talent and all of the rest. And it has sophisticated financial products that were designed to support all of this activity. It understands political risk a lot better than it did in the early 1990s or the mid 1990s when all of this was beginning. And all of the fruits of this experience are now being marshaled to help China put together an even bigger initiative called One Belt, One Road, which is to try to integrate in infrastructure terms Central Asia all the way to Western Europe along one axis, and then a maritime piece of this, as you all know,
Howard,
that will go through the South China Sea, around
Howard,
South Asia. I'm just finishing my last sentence here,
okay,
and all the way to the East African coast. So I'll stop there. I don't know if there's time for a couple of questions. I have to leave you all shortly myself, but I'm sorry, I tried to do a lot very quickly.
No, it was fascinating, and we didn't want to cut you off, but I'm glad you were able to get to the end there. Just very briefly, there were a couple questions that Liz posed at the beginning of this, and we just thought quickly if you had thoughts on kind of how China and the investors working with China, whether there's ways they can pursue a Belt and Road initiative that is more environmentally friendly, what kinds of steps they might be able to take, and then similarly, what steps might African countries be able to take to ensure that they get the benefits and less of the harms of some of these investments. Do you have any thoughts on either of those questions that you could share with us?
Sure. What I would say is that there's been a lot of learning. As I said, the China-Africa thing has served as a kind of training school in many regards for China in terms of its broader geopolitical strategies going forward. And there's been a lot of learning. There was a lot of learning at the same time by African countries in their engagement with China over the last 20 years. Initially, when China showed up with provincial construction companies wanting to build highways or ports or airports or housing or whatnot, the African countries, because they had become so neglected by the West, were almost irrationally exuberant, and they just signed on. These leaderships signed on to whatever was put before them, and this led to a lot of mixed results and in some cases, a lot of social unhappiness. The African populace, in many cases, was less delighted than some might have expected by the sudden flurry of construction activity. There were many motifs of complaint. The most famous of them was that China is bringing its own workers to do projects, and that even workers who were in relatively unskilled jobs, whereas African unemployment is very high, this didn't seem to be just from the perspective of African civil society. Civil society is an important word here. And so over the next 10 or 15 years, both sides, the African governments and the Chinese, came to understand that in order to make these projects sustainable and successful in the longer term, and in order to have the best benefit for China's image, which is an important piece of this kind of geopolitical and diplomatic strategy, there had to be a greater attentiveness to the broad public. You couldn't just deal with the regimes in question. You had to pay attention to civil society. You had to be more attentive to public opinion. And so I think this is the key with One Belt, One Road, that with One Belt, One Road, a lot of countries who have not yet engaged with China in terms of this scale and energy will go through their own, there's a risk that they will go through their own kind of irrational exuberance phase. And there's a risk also of backlash. And this is true in terms of the kinds of employment issues or local content issues, or intellectual property issues that we're all seeing with the Africans. But it's also true with the environmental question that, if you just put pre-drawn plans into a package and you offer up the financing and take it to an authoritarian country somewhere and you say, we'll do this for you if you'll just sign, and the country signs, and there's not a real careful sorting out of this whole range of issues, including environmental issues, that this can backfire locally in Kazakhstan, just to choose one example, or backfire in Beijing or for Beijing in terms of Beijing's global image. And so I think that's where we are now, where China, I think, is much more awake to the need to consider civil society, maybe because of the nature of China's own politics. Domestically speaking, in China, civil society is not, the state, political decisions are very centralized in China itself. And so this is a struggle. I'm going to use a word that can be interpreted in many different ways, but how democratic should this decision-making process around these projects be? Africa has shown certain benefits to China of thinking ahead of time about integrating the thoughts of civil society around problematic issues, including the environment, in its business and in its project planning. And it's an open question to see how much space will be accorded to this sort of democratic conversation in One Belt, One Road.
Thank you very much. So I know you have to go. I just want to thank you for joining us this morning. Sorry you couldn't be here in person to participate with us, so thanks.
Happy to have been able to do it. Thank you.
This session is April Rafiou, and April is an international communications consultant. She's spearheaded communication in support of global state and health organizations, including the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa and the U.S. Agency for International Development Africa Bureau. And she has a North Carolina connection as well, so she's working with the Department of Transportation and the Duke University Health System, so the connections here in North Carolina. So she's going to talk about the framing of Chinese engagement in Kenya and Nigeria as portrayed through the local media.
Good morning, and thank you for your kind introduction. I am like the PowerPoint queen, what they called me, but unfortunately I wasn't sure of the format of the presentation, so I'm going to have to be the public speaker queen today. My name is April Rafiou, and I want to talk to you a little bit about my research that I've done, as well as my work on communications and media in Africa. Famine, war, poverty, corruption, disease, disaster, savagery, anything bad, you name it, along with other words that I will dare not utter that have been mentioned in recent news. Africa has been called many things, and much of this message has been perpetuated by Western media. In fact, Western media have dominated much of the international airwave. And so in my research, I thought it was time to turn the tables, especially in light of the quote-unquote scramble for Africa. So I decided to look at what are Africa's media saying about the development that is happening in their country in terms of economic engagement and US and Chinese engagement specifically. So in this push into Africa, which many of the other speakers, especially, and I'm honored to be on the same panel with Mr. Howard French, as well as Michelle and others who will come after me. And when they talk about these issues, there's also this battle that's going on in the court of public opinion in Africa as China moves in. And so my research, which was called The Eagle versus the Dragon in Africa, focuses on international news framing, media framing from Africa's perspective. And I look specifically at Nigeria and Kenya. Nigeria has the largest population in Africa, and at the time that I did my research, Kenya had the largest economy in Eastern Africa. That has since changed. Ethiopia has usurped Kenya in that respect. So my research question primarily focused on how are the US and China being framed in the media, and I looked at newspaper coverage. And the reason why I chose this subject is because, of course, given the battle that's going on there in terms of China's push into the continent in an area that has historically been the US's territory or Western powers' territory. And so China, well, I'll start back up. When we talk about the US has primarily pursued a diplomatic approach, hard power. China, Africa, you do this, we'll give you this, conditional aid. You are our children, these are our babies. If you don't do what you've been asked to do, then there will be consequences. There will be less funding. China comes in, on the other hand, and with the soft power, a softer approach. And so this softer approach, the win-win, it appears to be a much, how do you say, less invasive approach on the surface. So China finds it very strange and it seems unfair to them to have a bad reputation, because a lot of times in the African countries, Africans see them as being a negative influence, or you're invading our territory. And understanding that historical perspective, especially of colonization, is quite natural that anyone who comes into African countries, they would view it this way. So my research questions focused on what news coverage is there about the US and China in terms of their economic engagement with the continent? And of the frames that are there, what is the valence? Is it positive or negative coverage? And then also, what are the determinants of international news coverage? Because if you're pursuing soft power, your goal is to get in there and to change the perception, get on the agenda, and actually have news coverage about your country, but also to influence it. So in understanding what all those variables are and what are the factors into ensuring that, hey, people are seeing China, they're seeing China in a positive respect, those are the things that I looked at. So the first thing that I looked at was prominence. And I looked at two newspapers. Again, there was one in Nigeria, This Day, which has the largest readership in Nigeria, and then Daily Nation in Kenya. And I looked at thousands of articles and then had to reduce it down to economic news articles to make sure it mentioned economic terms, economic engagement. And out of those articles, the US was most prominent. There were more articles, of course, about the US, and that's not surprising. They still dominate the international news space. In fact, and this goes back historically, because the transnational news agencies, the 5 that are there, they have historically sent out news across the nation. In terms of when you read a newspaper, when you get your news, oftentimes in the newspaper, whether it's the Washington Post or the New York Times, these news stories have been distributed by wire services such as the Associated Press or Reuters. So what happens is you receive the same news that someone in California may be receiving and someone in the United Kingdom may be receiving. So oftentimes news is distributed via these wire services. So when the wire services are dominating so much of the market, oftentimes the message is a uniform message, and they dominate, and Western media continue to push out that message that they want to distribute to the world. So again, the US was continuing to have more news coverage in those publications. But the question is, when China appears in news publications, I was trying to see what were the frames that were being used to describe both the US and China. So previous research had shown that there were some frames that were prevalent. They included competition between the US and China, controversy, because naturally bad news sells. If we say that if it bleeds, it leads. That's what you're going to see, the bad news. So I wasn't surprised to see controversy in there. Partner. In other words, China's goal is to see it as a win-win. But even when you talk about partnership, the U.S. is also a partner with Africa. So there were quite a few articles dealing with partnership. Refutation. And that's the idea that they're trying to refute some idea that's out there. Somebody in the article is talking about, hey, we don't agree with this, or China standing up for themselves and disputing some incorrect information. And lastly, watchfulness. In other words, are Africans saying we're being mindful? We don't trust, what's going on here, or there may have been an editorial piece in which someone talks about, hey, we need to be more aware as Africans in terms of U.S. and China's involvement. So those frames were present in the research that I did, but the most dominant frame was that of partner. And this could be good or bad, but most often they talked about the U.S. and China being a partner. And so I just wanted to dig a little deeper again, not just to see what the frames were, but to see what the valence was. Were these positive or negative articles? So in looking at that, I looked at both publications and those economic news articles, and surprisingly, the news coverage was more favorable towards China in both countries. There was a small margin. It wasn't statistically significant, given that I was looking at negative, neutral, and positive areas. But had I done positive and negative and eliminated that neutral category by means of the methods, it may have been so for those of you who do research of that nature. But the majority of the articles were positive about China, and which was quite surprising in that you had this turn of events. Wow, I only had a very short period of time. Okay, so to fast forward, I also looked at what were the determinants of international news coverage. Trade has historically been the determinant that determines how much news coverage you receive. China had a greater volume of trade with Kenya, and sure enough, there were more news articles there related to China. But the biggest finding from my research, and I'll end on this particular note, was the fact that when you looked at the newspaper, and you have the different sections. I'm going to just use this so that we can visualize this. So you have the front page. You may have lifestyle section, culture, oftentimes in these newspapers. And then you do have a business section. Excuse my chicken scratch. China was most visible in the business section of the newspaper. Anytime the articles actually appeared, that's where you saw China. And which was quite interesting given China's push for economic engagement and economic projects, infrastructure projects in the region. They're actually getting their message across. One of the things I talk about in the literature review is the fact that China's state media, their national media, they have their headquarters in Kenya. So the fact that there was more positive news coverage, especially coming out of Kenya, and the news coverage was in the business section, that tells us that push for public diplomacy, that push for soft power, and that push using the media specifically is starting to have an effect. So that was the key finding from my research. And so it's like, what does all of this mean? When you evaluate Africa's media, you do have to look at it somewhat subjectively, because in some cases, there are media freedoms. But even with the recent Nairobi-Mombasa project that was completed by China, oftentimes some media were hesitant to voice any objection to the project, because again, this is something that the state has supported. So why would you, as the media, you're supposed to go along with the flow and with the tide. Now, smaller newspapers, in just my experience in traveling to Africa, because as she mentioned, I've worked with USAID, the United Nations, and I continue to work with USAID in Africa. You hear the Africans, you hear the different sentiments, just like in any country, you have differences of opinion. It runs the spectrum. So, when you look at media, and I think, in terms of even my own future research, radio is also a viable media in Africa. People are using, there are smaller publications other than these larger publications. So it would be naive of anyone to presume that Africans are bystanders in this whole process. They are beginning to become more vocal. We have social media, and although connectivity is one of the issues that that exists there, they use WhatsApp. They use other means to communicate. So their smartphones are not necessarily like our smartphones, but they are using mobile technologies to communicate. So things are changing. Opinions are being formed, but in terms of China's push into the continent, public diplomacy, soft power, those are things that are important, but their push, especially using the media, may be actually having some effect. I could go on and on, but I know my time is up. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Thank you.
All right, well, we were planning a short break at this time, but because we're running late on the talks, we're just going to keep rolling. If you need to step out for a moment, we understand. So I'm going to introduce here Jackson Ewing. So Jackson actually just recently joined us here at Duke. He's joining the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, so he'll be working with me, which is wonderful. He's also going to be at the Stanford School of Public Policy, and he's going to be a liaison with Duke Kuchon University. So it's a new role, and it's just, I don't think you're officially here yet, right? Oh, I am. You are? Okay. Second week. Wow. Okay. Sorry. With all the snow days, I'm getting confused about who's when. All right. So Dr. Ewing was the director of Asian Sustainability at the Asian Society Policy Institute, ASPI, in New York, and led the Environment, Climate Change, and Food Security Program at the MacArthur Fellows in Singapore's Rajaratnam School of International Studies before joining us here at Duke. So I'm going to turn it over to Jackson.
Thanks, Lydia. Well, thank you all for having me, and thanks especially to the organizers for persevering on an event that easily, I know, could have wound up in the scrap heap. Given our time constraints and given from our dinner, I know how compelling the following two speakers are sure to be. I'm going to keep my comments brief. I'm going to avoid PowerPoints. I'm going to try to make 3 key points. First, I would like to try to extrapolate a bit on Liz's introduction of the BRI. What is the BRI? What is it for, from China's perspective? Secondly, I want to try to answer a couple of the questions that were put forward at the very beginning. How can recipient countries safeguard against the ills of the BRI and take advantage of opportunities within them? And also, how can Duke and its partners help in this endeavor? In answering that second question, of course, we have to talk a little bit about what those ills are. So I hope to put a little bit of meat on those bones as well. So what is the BRI? I think we should begin, or I should begin, by saying that I think it's a profoundly important piece of President Xi Jinping's vision for China's future and of his own personal leadership legacy. In China, symbolic and optical presentations of initiatives like this matter a great deal. And if we were to look at the official launch of the BRI last year, my former boss at ASPE in New York was present for that and came back with stories of lots of pomp and circumstance. We can say that this is something that will continue to guide much of China's foreign policy for years into the future. But that being said, it is far from being institutionalized, and to go even a step further, I think it lacks basic coherence. In part intentionally on China's behalf, as it really remains to be seen whether the BRI will be an umbrella under which foreign investment is captured, a branding exercise that can bring a lot of different foreign investments in China's periphery together, or a more ultimately coherent sort of policy space that has some commonalities among different projects rather than the current status quo, which I think is really defined by differentiation, including in Africa's case, which will be one of my key points here. What is the BRI for? I think we can look at it from business perspectives and also from diplomatic, strategic, and political perspectives, which April introduced to an extent. When we look at business, first of all, I think we look at the extraction of valuable resources. China's voracious appetite for minerals, oil, and gas is well documented and has changed exponentially in the past several decades. When we look at the investment patterns of China into African countries, for example, we see actually less diversification in the economies of these countries correlates with greater Chinese investment. So for those of us worried about the resource curse in which countries become increasingly dependent on the capital that they can gain from a particular extractable or lootable resource like a mineral or like an energy fossil fuel, this kind of sets some alarm bells off when we see that concentration of investment in the extractive industries. We also see the business case for China's going out policy, which was masterfully described by Howard and now exemplified by the BRI as a way to defray some of its excess capacity at home. China's booming steel industry, cement industry, largely building and construction capacity needs a place to go as the demand in China itself begins to wane. We also see a squeeze put on some conventional heavy industries and coal production in China for environmental, social, and economic reasons, leaving those industries also increasingly looking abroad for where their next opportunity sets will come. So taking some of this excess capacity, I think Howard went over this as well to an extent, into Africa and other developing countries on China's periphery is a key part of the business case for the BRI. When we look at the diplomatic, strategic, political sphere, we're, I think, talking about China's increase in influence, particularly in its near abroad, but ultimately in Africa, Latin America as well. Can China create the sorts of soft power connections that April mentions, and can it ultimately place more of these countries in its diplomatic orbit as a result? This is a real movement away from some of the previous going out policies of China, which had some degree of Maoist proselytization, some degree of kind of diplomatic overtures on issues such as Taiwan and recognition of the one China policy, et cetera. Now we're really looking at a more economically driven effort towards expanding that sphere of influence. If we take this to its most perverse conclusion, we could be looking at a situation in which client states are really beholden to the Chinese partner in a very disproportionate way and are victims of long-term loans and economic dependencies that can be outside of their own national interests. We've talked a bit about soft power versus hard power in the U.S.-China differentiation and their presence in Africa. I would like to add one more word to that, which is I think that China views these relationships in Africa transactionally, and that they see these business connections as being less value-laden and having less of this kind of morality-driven or politically ideologically driven sort of earmarks, and rather just a way to do business that can benefit them and hopefully benefit the recipient countries as well. So to get to our questions that Liz put out at the very beginning, how can recipient countries safeguard against the ills of the BRI? I think we need to begin by what those ills are, and we can divide them, environmentally speaking, into a few different categories. One, the environmental impacts of these extractive industries. When we're looking particularly in the mining sector, the stories of poor management on the back end of these mining efforts throughout many countries in Africa and increasingly on China's periphery are really pronounced. We can also look at the environmental impacts of large-scale infrastructure projects. Here, hydroelectric power can loom large, but also the land acquisition and the land dedication to things like road and rail also has a large role to play. And then we look at the longer-term impacts of locking in unsustainable energy infrastructure. Right now, by the count of some coal watchdogs, there are roughly 100 coal-fired power plants under construction in Africa. About 50 of those have Chinese investment in them. A very large $2 billion coal-fired installation is currently being constructed in Kenya. These are the sorts of projects that can have decadal long impacts for the air quality standards, the health impacts, and ultimately the greenhouse gas emissions of these countries, which will have far-reaching and long-term impacts. We also see the sort of long-term impacts on natural endowments that can come from China's, again, voracious appetite for resources from the continent. When we look at China's scale, we see if it increases its rice imports, and it hasn't traditionally been a rice importer, but is becoming one, by say 0.5%, the amount of hectares that need to come under cultivation internationally to meet that demand is massive. Now, this has traditionally been met by the Thailands, the Vietnams of the world. It's increasingly going to be met by farmland in Africa. Increasingly meeting the changing dietary preferences for beef and pork and fish will come in part from investment into the continent. This can lead to environmental impacts that cross certain thresholds that are very difficult to come back from, particularly in realms of deforestation, overfishing, and the like. This can be true also outside of traditional agricultural products and other land-intensive sectors like palm oil, pulp and paper, etc. Again, typically fed by peripheral Asian states. Increasingly, I think we'll see some of those sectors moving into fertile ground, literally, in this case, in Africa. So, turning to this question, how can recipient countries safeguard against these sorts of problems? Now, I would just like to make two real points, and they both center from different directions on challenging the monolithic characterization of both China and of recipient countries, particularly in Africa. And what I mean by that is that if there's one kind of steady constant when looking at the environmental and, for that matter, social and economic impacts of Chinese investment in Africa, it's differentiation. In different places, with different policies, with different levels of implementation, with different levels of civil society engagement, different legal structures, different ability to carry out regulations, you get different results. China's behavior is not uniform across these different contexts or across these different geographies. So the actual operations matter. They are not run roughshod over by a uniform China policy that they cannot push back against. And the variety, which unfortunately I don't have time to go into in any detail, I'm sure that my following speaking colleagues might have some additional kind of substance for this, is going to depend in large part on the actions of those recipient countries. And in China, we have massive differentiation in their approaches to these BRI projects, not least of all where the funding is coming from. If the funding is coming from the AIIB, the Asian International Infrastructure Bank, then it's going to be pursued under a set of statutes that's quite similar to those that you would see under the Asia Development Bank, the World Bank, etc. If you see the financing coming from the Chinese Development Bank, the Chinese Export-Import Bank, some venture capital funds, then it's going to be pursued with often a different set of standards and a different set of stipulations as to how that finance can be used, and ultimately a different set of concerns over social and environmental impacts. We also see, in China's case, different intentions, I think, behind some of these investments. Some are going to skew more towards that business case. In the case of extractive industries, it's quite straightforward, but also in the case of infrastructure development, we can see some second and third order goals that are to essentially try to create stronger trading partners in the future, create greater infrastructure links, similarly to the example from Gabon, when we see the connections along the coastline. Is that going to be a profitable road construction project in the conventional sense, that it's going to be paying back money in the near term? Not necessarily, but if it makes a more efficient economic zone for China to operate in as an early entrant, then this can ultimately benefit China's larger goal to enhance its business and trading relationships in that part of the world. So finally, how can Duke and its partners help? Well, if you take me at my word that the policies and ability to carry out those policies of recipient countries actually matters, then I think that leads us to a logical conclusion that trying to train and help capacity build in these countries that will be recipients of BRI investment is a laudable and worthwhile place to be in. So on the recipient country side, I think that there is a great deal of opportunity for experts at Duke and in our partnering organizations to try to train some of these political leaders in environmental impact assessment and things that are specific to the BRI and how BRI investment is likely to arrive in their country. What historical records, such as that which Howard goes over in great detail in his book and more briefly this morning, can tell us about how China is likely to behave in certain contexts and how they can take advantage of the BRI rather than being taken advantage of by it. And on the China side, I think that there's a conversation to be had internationally and domestically in China about its standards and choices for BRI investment. Can we get those standards in the Development Bank and the Exim Bank, both controlled by the Ministry of Finance, up towards something closer to the AIIB? I don't know the answer to this question, but there are levers to pull and there are arguments to make, both internationally among China's peer countries and places like the G20, but also in our conversations through partnerships like ours at Duke Kunshan and elsewhere. So thanks, I'll end with that.
Thank you, Jackson. That's great. I just want to take a moment. So he talked about training, and I just want to note that we have had conversations with the Duke Center for International Development, which does training of development officials and managers in other countries as a possible place where Duke could play a role in training officials from other countries. That might be an opportunity for Duke to pursue. So our next speaker is Tao Hu from World Wildlife Foundation in their China program. He's an ecologist and environmental economist by training and a veteran insider on China's environmental policy with almost 2 decades of experience working at the Policy Research Center of China's Ministry of Environmental Protection. He's been involved in a number of different things, but he was in particular a pioneer in China focusing on environmental issues arising out of international trade. So his talk today is titled Greening Infrastructure Along the Belt and Road. If you want to walk, you can take this with you, or you can speak. Okay.
Thank you very much, Lydia, for your introduction. So hello, everyone. Very nice to be here. Thanks, Liz, Lydia, Sarah, Kate, for your inviting me to be here to share. Can you bring the mic? Oh, sorry, I can't get in closer. Oh, take the mic. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Thank you for your, oh, it's too loud. Thank you for your inviting me to be here to share, WWF, our work on the Belt and Road. So as a beginning, Liz said, I did suffer yesterday, drove all the way down from DC area to be here. Suffered in the snowy road, but by the Chinese proverb, actually, big snow indicates a big harvest in the coming season. So I would say good luck for Nicholas Institute to harvest your research results this year. So today our workshop, the key topic is infrastructure. So I want to share with you some of our thoughts about the infrastructure, how we can greening infrastructure. And I tell you a story. As a China program director, I often back and forth between the 2 capitals of the top 2 countries in the world. So I tried to set up a meeting with Justin Lin, a meeting about our Belt and Road work with him. Justin, for your information, he was the chief economist and the vice president of World Bank before. Right now, he's the dean of the School of South-South Cooperation at the Peking University. And also, he's the director of new Structural Economic Center of Peking University. So I tried a couple of times, but I never, so far, still have not set up a meeting with him. Every time, I try to set up a meeting with him, he's busy, he's traveling, and anyway, I met his assistant director. I asked her, what's the reason why Justin is so busy? He said, he is very, very busy because he so often, travels between China and Africa countries. He's a key economic advisor of Ethiopia government. He has to often meet the premier and the president talking about the economic advisors, economic policies. So one of his big, topic, talk to the premier and the president of Ethiopia is infrastructure. Because from his new structure economics, infrastructure is very, very necessary as a key component of the economic system. And also more important is a precondition to let the market better work out private goods and services. The infrastructure as part of the public goods and services should be provided by government or PPP approach. This is also China's successful experiences. He thought he could share with African countries. He was popular in World Bank. I learned from my World Bank friends, he was popular when he worked in the World Bank. He's popular for the Africa economist, but not popular for the Western economist in the World Bank. The reason, he often promotes his new structural economics to share his China's successful experiences to start infrastructure first before promoting other economic activity. He thought it's a precondition. So that's partly also explain to you why China is promoting infrastructure in Africa countries. That's a precondition to start other economic activities. Also, as a footnote to Harvard French, at the beginning he mentioned why China is going to Africa. So why infrastructure first? That it is China's experiences. I have a lot of, if you're interested, I have a lot of stories to share with you, China's infrastructure development. So I may or may not agree with President Trump's, his opinions, his ideas, his policies. But one policy I strongly support him is to enhance infrastructure in U.S. That's very important. This is only policy, or not only policy. Anyway, this is very important policy. I support him. So when having the infrastructure projects, definitely there are environmental risks. My previous speakers has already mentioned the environmental risks and also environmental impacts as well. In order to reduce the risk, to mitigate the environmental impacts, to have a green infrastructure is very, very important to mitigate, to reduce. But what is the green infrastructure? So my research team did literature analysis and found the information. Actually, green infrastructure requires green certifications. We need either the safeguards or the specific certification to certify the green infrastructure. But lack of coherence among all of the green certification system. No international standardized green certification. And also need an environmental impact assessment for sure, but the specific questions, which guidance and the standards should follow, the EIA should follow the host country one, should follow the investing country one, or should follow the international one. That is, I think, the environmental standards issue. I leave the question, I skip this one because I have already invited the Nicholas Institute to join me to have another specific forum on environmental standards of Belt and Road in Shanghai, late May this year. And for the how to promote it, promote the green infrastructure, I think the policy matters a lot. National governmental policies and international both could play a vital role to promote the green infrastructure. So the national, including the host African country governments and the Chinese government too. And for the, wanna tell you, share you some of insider view. Lydia earlier mentioned that I used to work for the Chinese government as working in the Policy Research Center of Ministry of Environment Protection. That time I remember internally we talked with the Minister of Commerce, Minister of Finance, and NDRC, these line ministries, talking about the guidelines of the Chinese outbound investment. And between MEP and MOFCOM, there is a tension. MEP thought we should let the Chinese outbound investment companies to follow Chinese EIA law. And MOFCOM says we should let them follow the host country law. They are even seeing by the term here, in Rome, we should do as Romans do. We don't have to intervene their sovereignty even. They are talking about that. So eventually, the guidelines actually not specific mention the EIA should follow the Chinese law. International organizations also should play a very important role. So for trade, investment, and those organizations play a very important role. International Standardization Organization, WTO, UN system, UN environment, UNDP, UN DESA, those UN agencies also should play a role to somehow, at least to let the existing current green certification system to be harmonized. But there are various different environmental standards, different green certification system by the international organizations, and also IGOs and NGOs. WWF ourselves also have developed many commodity and environmental standards, green standards. Like for soybean, we have RTRS. For palm oil, we have RSPO. For beef, we have Sustainable Beef Roundtable. For fish, we have MSC, ASC standards. Those standards actually are among the standards, and together with other organizations promoting the standards, are really lack of coherence. When we're talking about international standard, which international standard we're talking about? Actually, it is really need to be harmonized in the future from the research perspective. So with WWF, our approach actually is to greening infrastructure along the Belt and Road, and not only beyond the infrastructure, actually, we are greening every products as possible. So far, we have done a couple of case studies along the Belt and Road. Greening infrastructure, green finance, organic tea, ecotourism, renewable energy, green automobile. Those are the specific case studies that we're working on between China and Belt and Road countries. So this is also to share with our Nicholas Institute colleagues what we are doing in this field, partly answer the question Liz mentioned, raised the third question. So what Nicholas Institute should do or could do. So we are WWF. We're not a Greenpeace. We normally don't against the projects. We constructively to change the direction slightly from the general trade investment, general infrastructure to green one. So that's the work we're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to hear all of that work, and hopefully we can partner in different ways. Our next speaker is Jingjing Zhang. She's a visiting scholar at the Environmental Law Institute, and she's an Open Society Foundation's fellow. She represented pollution victims and helped communities organize public hearings on environmental rights in China. Through her work as a litigation director with the Beijing-based Center for Legal Assistance to Pollution Victims between 1999 and 2008. And she did a variety of other environmental litigation cases in Chinese courts. So that's a bit about her background and where she's coming from. She's going to talk about Chinese overseas investment, the environmental and social impact, and legal accountability.
I'm thrilled to be here and overcome the snowstorm and from all the way from DC and make it. And before I give my formal presentation and to follow Dr. Hu Tao's presentation, I will share the quote I found in one of the African museum, and I will ask the question: can you guess which railway it mentioned in this quote? It said, "It is not uncommon for a country build a railway, but it is uncommon for a railway to create a country." Can you guess which railway is it? Yes. Yeah, this is the quote I found in the Kenya National History Museum, and it was said by Sir Charles Ennet from England, and it mentioned that railway built by British 100 years ago, and it stopped running just 1 month before the China financed new railway start run on May 30th. I was there. I was watching the opening ceremony and all this. President, Vice President, the Chinese embassy, ambassador, they're all there. And I watched the ceremony from the TV. And yeah, I needed to briefly introduce my background. I'm a lawyer by training, by profession. I have been starting my environmental law practice since 1999 when I joined this Beijing-based legal clinic, Center for Legal Assistance to Pollution Victims. And I have been suing against polluters, government, for years, and the ways I want to use litigation, legal action to protect the environment as well as people's rights. And I have I litigated some important case, and one of the class action case make me China's Aaron Brockovich, and some Chinese students may not know because that movie, when it translated to Chinese and changed the name, and the name they used in Chinese is 永不妥协, and if I translate back to English, literally is never give up. And I think that's a Chinese name can represent what I'm doing, never give up to take legal action to protect our environment and, as well as our people's rights. The right to clean environment, to clean water, clean soil, and clean food. That is our fundamental human rights. And so I'm conducting a project. This is a hybrid research and action project, and based on Open Society Foundation support. And I have been traveling to Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Mongolia. And my project is not Africa per se, and rather I'm looking at all Chinese outbound investment to see its environment and social impact. And last year, I traveled to 4 African countries, all the way from South Africa to West Africa and then East Africa. And I would like to show these two cases, and those two cases are not infrastructure project, they are mining. So that later I will show my findings with the infrastructure versus extraction project. And the mining is in Serenian. And just to quickly show the picture of that was a trip, a field trip. I followed a local NGO. I go to the village, and we have the village meeting on the mango tree, and I visited the place. That is a relocated village. 3 of the village were relocated from the mountain to the lower place, and from mining site, basically from mining site to another site, and that is a kitchen built by the company, and I will mention it later. And you see in the village, they do not have a water resource, and that is the tank, and there will be truck transport the water, drinking water from other place to the village, and so the children and the village can take the drinking water from there, from the tank to their home, and there is no running water in the village. This is a relocated place. And they used to live in close to mining site, and there was a river, so they can take the water from the river instead of this tank. And then you see the river. And some villages are still there. There's villagers are still living close to mining site, and this is their source for the drinking and irrigation. And from the color of the river, you must say it's heavily polluted. The color of the brown and red reflect this iron and copper and other heavy metal pollution in the river. And so they gave up that river, and they found this little stream here, but still polluted. From the color you can see it's still polluted. And all these children, and when we were there, they came out, and they are very happy. And even though I worry about their future, their health, and the mining site hasn't been running so long, and so the health impact are not so obvious yet. And when I was there, they are shouting, and they just they're very happy to see some stranger there, some visitor from outside world, and they repeating one word. And I asked my NGO friend what they're calling me. They said white in local language. They thought I'm a white person. I'm Asian. I'm Chinese. That sure they have never seen any Chinese from the company. The company is owned by a provincial owned an iron and steel company from China. This is the long story. The Chinese company bought the share. They start negotiation with not NOCO. It's a British company called the African Mineral, which has a very notorious reputation on the environment and human rights. And these two companies made a deal in around 2011, and they made the joint venture on this iron and coal mine in northern Serenian. And then African Mineral went in bankruptcy, and the Chinese company became the only owner of the mine. And there's still this ongoing conflict between the owner, the Chinese company, with the local community, villagers, and the town resident. And that is a case in Serenian. Another case is in Ghana, and that is a small-scale minings, and those miners from China are not companies; they're individuals. They're individual miners, and they are spending their own money. They are not borrowing from Chinese banks, and they are spending their family. They borrow money and they bought equipment. They went to Ghana, and they start their project in Ghana, and it caused a severe social impact in Ghana because you can see those individual miners, unlike the big gold mining company in Ghana, they do not clean up. They do not do any follow-up work, and they move from one side to another side, and they leave this huge hole on the riverbank. And I was there. I was driving along the river for 100 kilometers, and I saw so many the sites, small-scale gold mining sites left by Chinese gold miner. So these two cases can show just the example is with Chinese investment in Africa do cause environment impact as well as social impact, the impact to the people's livelihood and the people's health, and how we can solve the problem. And that is my question. The project is to answer those questions. And some of my findings I would like to share. First is I visited the 4 African countries, and when we talk about the Chinese-owned project, for most infrastructure projects, the general public have a quite positive feedback words. And like Mombasa-Nairobi Railway, I asked many ordinary people I met in Nairobi, and I asked them, how do you think about this project? And the Uber driver, my landlord, said, "Oh, we need it. We hope China can help us build the road and the railway." And when I visited NGOs, and I visited one of the NGO protect elephant, they said the Chinese company did go to their office and ask their advice on how to avoid affect the elephants. So Chinese company did some work, but other NGO, the lawyer said the project hasn't done the EIA, they hadn't done a thorough EIA. You see the EIA report, but it's not enough, and it's not thorough. And so the lawyers, the public interest lawyer, filed litigation against government, not Chinese company, for the fail to complete the EIA report and to issue the approval to the project Chinese company. But the project is still going on, and it has been running since May. And that is the infrastructure project. For most extraction projects, you see this very negative impression from local people, from NGO, and this anti-China sentiment in those communities affected by the Chinese mining project is very strong. That is my findings or my impression from during my trip. And second is the Chinese company heavily rely on the local government support. They are very reluctant to communicate with local NGO and the communities. Whenever the community or NGOs complain, try to contact, organize some meeting, try to meet the Chinese management team from the companies, they often respond to this. Looks like the standard answer, because I ask many questions in all those countries. The answer almost the same. Go to talk with your own government. We are invited by your government, and if you have any concern, complaint, go to talk with your government. That is answer from Chinese companies to the community, to the NGO. And so that is one of my findings. And third is host countries' political and legal environment is a big factor to influence Chinese companies' performance, environment and social performance on the environment and human rights. And you may not clear the Chinese have. China also has a huge investment in developed countries, in US, in Canada, in Australia. And in some developing countries like South Africa, and in those countries, Chinese companies they are performing well and they behave well. And because the host countries' political and legal systems are strong, the institutions are strong in those countries. While in those developing countries, desperately need financial support, and those countries with weak institutions, Chinese companies tend to, take the advantage of the weak institution. That's the case I showed in Sierra Leone. And so that, I think that my third findings answer the question how Duke can play a role. I think the bars should be raised on both sides, in China and in the Chinese investment host countries. In China, I think our government has this responsibility to regulate Chinese outbound investment, to require better or higher requirements on the Chinese companies. And in Chinese investment host countries, the bar should be raised too, and the legal requirement and the better management and regulation should be made, and the general governance system should be improved. And that is my finding, and that is my, and I hope we can have a conversation, so I will leave time for you to ask questions.
Thank you so much, Jingjing, and all the speakers. We've come to the end of the time we said. However, I believe we can stay in this room a little longer. So what I'm going to suggest is anybody who has we've only asked you to commit till noon. So please don't feel the least bit hesitant to leave if you're ready or need to. But for those of you who are interested in staying, I'm going to ask our speakers to come up here to answer a few questions. As you know, Howard French couldn't, and Michelle Lee also did have another commitment. So we're just going to go for about 15 minutes more, but if you all could come up, and I'm going to just start by saying I think that you all did a great job and sort of went from the range of looking at China going out, but also Africa coming in, I guess you could call it. And I think we were pretty clear what the three questions were, but I'll remind in case there are folks who weren't there at the beginning. The first question was really, China has publicly committed to make Belt and Road a green infrastructure. How can we make that, how can China make that a reality? And the second question was more from the host country, recipient countries. How can these countries get the benefits of all this investment while also protecting themselves against some of these environmental and social harms, taking advantage of but not being taken advantage of? And then finally, what might we do amongst Duke and Duke Kunshan along with partner institutions? Now, some of you already directly answered that, but do any of you want to say anything more on that before we sort of open it up?
I'd love to hear from the audience.
Okay, so let me ask if anyone in the audience wants to respond to that or have sort of related questions. And I think Prasenjit is going to be the first one. I think you can press the button so that we can hear. And we are recording this, so. Hello?
Thank you very much. That was very enlightening. I'm not a specialist in this area, but I was struck by, especially the last two speakers, but perhaps all that. It's something that I've been getting a sense that it really depends upon the host country and how much. And the Chinese are responsive. I know this from the Mekong area, where they have, and they have been very responsive in the Mekong area. But because there's a huge civil society movement there, although their governments are not necessarily very responsive. So in the African case, I see that, from what I hear, it's Kenya that had a big civil society movement, and the railroad in particular, and that there were several efforts to of the Chinese, I don't know what the company was. I think it was probably a central government company that built the railroad or something. But they did respond, they did talk. Also, not talking about Africa, but Pakistan, in Balochistan, they have tried to talk to the rebels as well. So I don't know, but let's, if somebody knows something about the Kenyan situation, we'd love to know more.
Okay. Yes, civil society in Kenya is very active. The civil society NGOs are very active, and when I visited there, I visited various NGOs who are doing the public interest litigation, or they are just doing pure nature conservancy work. And I also visited WWF Kenya office, and so yeah, they are doing projects on the different perspective and to hold Chinese investment accountable. And some said good words on the Chinese investment, like I mentioned the Safe Elephant. The organization said yes, the Chinese company did come to our office, and they try to receive our advice in save the elephant. Yeah. Yes, this organization can save the elephant. It's in the suburb of Nairobi, and I think that civil society, the activities that from the civil society makes Chinese company more responsible, and they are responding to the request from the community, from the individual, from civil society and organizations. Unlike in those place in Serenian, for example, I visited, the Chinese company are not responding to the community's request. And so build the vibrant civil society is I think it's crucial for the host countries. And that is, we can see, actually, you see if you compare Chinese company versus Western-based company, you can see the difference. Because in Western-based multinational company, in their home countries, the civil society are very active. They are holding their companies legally accountable for their violation in other countries. And while China, we couldn't. But that is my mission. And I think my work is, yes, I'm a representative of the Chinese civil society.
I just want to add something that's not that's a bit different, because you brought up the Mekong River Commission, or excuse me, the Mekong countries. I think it's also instructive in the sense that, like the Mekong, China prefers to operate bilaterally instead of any kind of multilateral forum. China's refused to engage with the Mekong River Commission. They seek to divide rather than work in a unified way with ASEAN in many cases, most recently using Cambodia as a mouthpiece on the South China Sea issue. And I think that that's going to continue to inform some of our interpretations of Chinese policy on the continent and elsewhere. When we're looking at these shared ecosystems like the Mekong, which involves all of these countries in the basin, and China's going individually one by one and striking different deals, which can affect that watershed and affect those natural endowments and food security and fisheries, et cetera, downstream, this can create some challenges, but it's also something that we should expect to continue.
Yeah, I want to also go further to talk about the civil society. Since we are people here, mostly we're environmental people, so we are easily to hear the voice from environmental NGOs. However, think about in Africa countries, also partly answer your question, second question, what the host country should do. You know, in the host country, there are also many other types of NGOs, like labor union, they're hunting for jobs, and the poverty alleviation organization, they are trying to reduce poverty issue. So those people are not always, same with environmental NGOs view, might be different. Give you an extremely example. Recently, China started a new policy, actually exactly from the 1st of January this year, to have a domestic trade ban for every products. Following actually China is a country in the world first to ban domestic trading of those products. US has not done it yet. Only a couple of states have banned the domestic trading. Second is to regulate international trade for these products. But China is a country first has a completely domestic ban. Japan has not done it yet. This is good for the environment. It is very, very good. However, this idea, this new policy is not being welcomed by many, elephant farming business people in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, WWE already heard such a kind of voice. This is affected their business. This is somehow by the developing a level somehow is also understandable if we have a broader view, not only look at it from the environmental perspective. Yeah.
And I want to piggyback on that. To whom much is given, much is required, but I want to take that one step further. From whom much is taken, much is required as well. There needs to be a sense of transparency on the part of the host country, as well as the foreign actors who are coming in, because what happens is the African countries are striking these bad deals. There isn't a sense of transparency. So I think on the part of the host country, to answer your second question, that when you talk about civil society desires to have this openness and information about what's happening, so that they can, be more, they're already vigilant, they're already talking, but to take that one step further to ensure that, hey, we can have trust. Anytime you have a relationship between two entities, it requires a sense of trust. So that transparency has to be there from the actual recipient country.
Just to pick up on that last point, I know, April, you have looked particularly at newspapers and the media. Do you see there's a greater role that the media can play in working with civil society to achieve that?
Yes, as we continue to see more countries becoming more democratic, I think that's the key. Then you'll start to see, and you're seeing it in the media, whether it's Zimbabwe or whether you see uprisings in different countries and where they're changing the system. People are becoming empowered, and that's how you can actually make a change. So I think the media combined with civil society, combined with the NGOs, they're forcing and requiring more accountability from the government. So environmental issues, that will continue to be on the agenda. And it's about, everybody's trying to put their different topic and different focus on the agenda. But as long as you have vigilant groups, these NGOs, they can make a difference. They can literally get environmental concerns on the agenda. And that comes through the media. So it's a give and take.
All right, do we have any other comments or questions?
Hear me? Can you hear me?
Okay. Is it better? We can hear you. I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah. So my questions, particularly for the later two speakers, but like in general, like if anybody want to say anything, yeah, welcome. So I'm interested in the civil society in the host countries and its impact to the civil society movement on the domestic of China. So, my area of knowledge is mostly in Southeast Asia, particularly about Burma and Cambodia and Laos area, and we see that kind of impact is already taking place, given that incident of the suspension of the Misong Dam project in 2011, right? And I think that is a really big impact domestically for Chinese. I saw a lot of articles, and those are not banned articles, talking about how our way of outbound investment should think differently now. We should not just seek permit from the government. We should seek social permits, and that's a big discourse within Chinese society. So I wonder how much of that like new mindset has been, like elevated to the policy makers circle. And Dr. Fu is talking about the debate and tension between MOFCON and Ministry of Environmental Protection. How much of that is actually translated to force, Exim Bank of China to really enforce its environmental protection rule, which we all know is very arbitrary, right? And it's also very depending on who is involved and like what SOE we're talking about, and how feasible it is to actually, enforce it or force those regionally owned SOEs, which we all know their standards of like enforcement is like much lower than the central SOEs, particularly for a lot of them actually from Yunnan province, and they just kind of go southward to their neighbors and just do whatever.
That's really a good question. Actually, earlier I mentioned the tensions between MOFCOM and MEP, but the tension is still existing. And I think I would share more with you about the debates. Actually, for SOEs, after the Misong Dam and other a couple of scandals happened before. Actually, SOE is much easier to the Western media's, very different with the Western media's report. SOE is much better managed their environmental issue rather than private companies. SOE, the reason I tell you the rationale, the SOE is because if they do something bad, that's really damage China's image. That would be blamed not only by SASAC, the organization managing the SOEs, also by the president and premier. Those people are politically appointed as CEO or president of the company. They probably lose their jobs. That's why they're so careful about their behaviors. However, compared with SOEs, the private companies, even the individuals early Jingjing mentioned in Ghana, they don't care. They only care money, profits. They don't care, they care nothing, only money. So they do whatever they want to do. I would say this is very bad. So that's a very different, reported by Western media. By the way, React April's early his presentation. So, and here actually I have also I found just a big surprise. I saw my former colleagues from Policy Research Center, Chen Chao is here, and also my WRI former colleagues, Monica is here. So they probably also can help me to answer the question partly later. Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Talking about the civil society, the space for civil society in China, you must aware after 2012, the space has been shrinking, and especially after the law, the foreign NGO management law was passed in 2015. So the resource and from outside, the resource to Chinese NGO from their colleagues from outside world is limited, and so that space is not big enough. But I know Chinese NGOs are still trying to push back, and I do not know how far they can push back. But there is I think there's demand from the rest of the world and from the countries where NGOs they demand the Chinese NGOs to work with them. So there is a demand. I think the Chinese civil society organization will be responding those demands from other world, and as well, the Chinese government now is encouraging NGO going out, and representing China's interest, and they're encouraging Chinese NGO, but by the Chinese government definition, Chinese NGOs are Gango. We all know those Gango, government-controlled non-government organization. We have we do not short of those Gangos, but there are some real grassroots NGO. They are trying to work. They are trying to following Chinese company. I think I'm part of those groups, and so we'll see. I think that as long as there is a demand, and Chinese NGOs will be responding to it.
Add a few words about the NGO going out. Actually, my friend, he works in the Chinese Poverty Alleviation, Gango. He said China should not only G2G, government to government, B2B, business to business in Africa, also should have a new term, P2P, people to people. That's why his organization has already, right now, in Ethiopia, in Burma. And also a little bit more about, I forgot to reply earlier your question about the lessons learned from the CPI, the China Power Investment Company, after the lessons they learned from Burma. When they started a new business in Angola, in other African countries, they're really careful to deal with not only the government, also NGOs. They said, I knew the key person dealing the business in Angola. He said they really learned the lessons from the Burma case, me Sung Dam case.
Does anyone in the audience want to add an extra comment to this discussion?
Can I just ask on this, when you talk about private, what do you mean? I mean, you're talking about individuals, or you're talking about big private companies? And what are they?
Yeah, both.
How big is the biggest?
I think the biggest, they're, Alibaba, of course, is the big private company. Is big enough, right? Of course, there are many others, but Alibaba actually is not care enough compared with PetroChina, Sinopec, because for Sinopec, PetroChina, they lost their jobs, the CEO, but Alibaba, they don't care. They are responsible to the board, not to the president premier.
Okay, we're going to take one last question.
Thank you. I'm a fourth-year PhD here. Actually, have been receiving tremendous help from both Lydia and also Sarah on my PhD project, trying to figure out the impact of infrastructure from China. So this has been really, really helpful. I looked back to my WeChat, which is similar to Facebook, and found that the first book I borrowed was actually The China's Second Continent by Howard. When I read that book and posted like a note on my page saying that I'm really worried and like why Chinese companies are not doing the good things outside, they're really destroying our image outside of China, my friend immediately replied to say that you should read Dragon's Gift. Okay, so I'm just trying to ask this question on like how do we get a real view, like image of what's really happening on the ground in Africa. Because lots of the books are written by Western journalists, and also some articles are written by Chinese, which are dramatically different in terms of their tones of characterizing the events happening. it's really weird to see any books written by African. At least I haven't really read any. So this is really a question for you and also maybe other people, like how, as students or researchers, can we get, a balanced view and a real view from what's the African countries, like people over there, really think about this investment? How could China help in that sense? And relatedly, because lots of students here are master and PhD students, I wonder if you can give any advice on what skills we should actually learn while we are in Nicholas School to be able to help in the future in terms of making this a better, more environmental approach. Thank you.
To answer your first question, I'm not sure if you've heard of the piece, How Not to Write About Africa. It was pretty famous a few years back, and it's actually written by an African. And it's a satire where he goes through and says all of the things you shouldn't say in terms of communicating about Africa, and, the stereotypical savage terms, and don't describe elephants, people running around without clothes and things like that. But that was the first attempt to kind of bring out the issue of the fact that people are talking about Africans in a stereotypical biased way. You're right. Most of the perspectives have come from the West or from China or Chinese people who are interested in studying the continent as a subject. That will come, I think, through time, whereas you have more Africans who are taking a stand and conducting research. I think one of the great things about China that they've been doing as they've been expanding, there has been this knowledge transfer, and they've been training. I think it's about building the capacity of Africans to, whether it's to build their own projects or enable them to contribute to economic growth, but also to tell their story. Right now, a lot of what you're seeing in terms of everybody else telling their story is because everybody else has the money. That's how news works. The news flow works because those corporations are run by Western powers, or in this case, China is using its media because they're opening more and more media bureaus in Africa because they realize the power of the media to change minds, to change perceptions. So that will come over time, whereas Africa starts to tell its own story. They are rising. They're trying to tell that story more. They're telling it intercontinentally, but in terms of telling that story global and changing the narrative, changing the global narrative about Africa, that'll happen slowly through time.
I think in the academy, there's real fertile ground for more collaborative writing between African scholars and those in China and those in the West. For the past several years, I've been working on some climate change cooperation projects between Northeast Asian countries, Japan, Korea, China, et cetera. And one of the mechanisms that we found particularly effective is to find some of the leading thinkers in each of those countries, bring them together in roundtable or seminar formats, and then have them write something together about fairly contentious and difficult topics that they might not agree on the surface, but to try to facilitate finding something worthwhile to say that addresses that very contentiousness. So I think that perhaps those of us on the Duke side and those of us in the next generation of scholars like yourself could look at opportunities like those. Thanks.
As I said, in the image of China in Africa, they're different. It depends on who you are asking the question. If you ask NGOs and ask the general public or ask the local government official, you get different answer. I know both book. I read both book, and I know Harvard French, and I went to the Deborah, the author of the Dragon's Gift. I went to her the conference. Definitely they have a different perspective, different point of view of China's presence in Africa. I think both have their reasons. And Harvard book, you see, he interviewed a lot of the ordinary people there. This personal story that their real image from the people there. And as my traveling there, I got different answers. And some people like China, some people like China, some people do not. And so it's your own responsibility to make to reveal what China is, or who China is, what China's image is in those countries. And as a scholar, you will at least expose that image from your perspective, and the audience can make their own judgment and tell the truth, the fact.
That sounds like a good note to end. I really appreciate our 4 speakers and our other 2 that couldn't stay to the end, and all of you. Obviously, this conversation is not going to end here, but we'll continue on. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you all and thanks to the Duke Africa Initiative for funding this event. So enjoy the rest of the weather and day, and